Hey 3DMJers, this is the Godfather, Jeff Alberts, and you are listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. In this episode, I'll be talking to my colleagues Brad Loomis and Eric Helms all about refeeds, or high days, or cyclical dieting, or whatever term you may have heard for planned increases in caloric intake during an extended cutting phase. We began this episode with an in-depth discussion on how refeeds originated and how they were initially practiced based on anecdotal feedback. Then we get into the real science of refeeds and the intricate relationships between energy intake, energy expenditure, appetite, and hormonal feedback. And finally, we end the episode with some practical takeaways, discussing exactly how we prescribe refeeds for our competitors and what we consider when creating our nutrition plan for them at different points in their season. As usual, if you have any feedback or comments on this episode, head on over to 3dmusclejourney.com or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Team3DMJ and leave it under podcast number 143. Here is All About Refeeds, featuring myself, Brad Loomis, and Eric Helms.
So refeeds are an interesting thing because we've been using these suckers. Well, I mean, hey, I think, man, we've been using these since the very beginning of 3DMJ. Because I remember my first prep in '07, I was using refeeds. Berto did refeeds. And then when I met you guys, Brad and Jeff, that was kind of a newer thing. Because I don't think, Brad, correct me if I'm wrong, did you use refeeds in your '08 prep?
I did. No.
You did?
I did not.
Okay.
I used
yeah.
in '09 prep.
'09. All right, that's what I thought. And then, Jeff, for most of your career, correct me if I'm wrong, you were not using refeeds.
Well, they weren't structured. They were called binges.
Right. So they weren't exactly what we would classify as a refeed. It was more like, man, I'm dieting too hard and eat Oreos out of control. So.
Word.
Boom. Love that. Mini Oreos. See, that's portion control right there.
That's it.
So when did you start using refeeds? When was your first prep, Jeff? Was that 2011?
That was 2011. Like my first prep under your guys' guidance.
Right.
I'm talking with my mouth full. I'm talking about refeeds. Right.
It's perfect, really. So yeah, this is interesting. So 3DMJ was definitely, and when I say quote unquote 3DMJ, like the 3DMJ is a lot of things. Obviously, I think it primarily is the ethos that Jeff, you started in your blog, but I think the nerdy science bullshit that me and Berto kind of brought to the table.
The bullshit.
That bull.
You know that bullshit that's helped the sport grow tremendously over the last decade. Yeah, that bullshit.
Exactly, that nonsense science stuff. But yeah, kind of what like me and Berto brought to the table with our nerdy internet stuff was refeeds. But we didn't start it by any means, because I know that, like I said, in '07, when I was working with Lane, he had me set up with 2 refeeds a week. And I know that way back in the day, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I mean, Dr. Joe was using refeeds for a while as well, and I think he traditionally used like 1 bigger one, and Lane started using like 2 smaller ones split up in the week. And even before that, I remember, like, I think there's some pretty popular bodybuilding diets where you'd be like 5 days on and then have 2 days where you'd have a cheat meal on the weekend, So in my kind of understanding of things, some concept of having higher calorie days has been a part of the bodybuilding culture for a while.
You know that you just mentioned that, because I remember, like you said, it was cheat meals, and I just remember, like, I'm not going to do that, because just that word cheat, I was like, I'm not going to cheat on my diet. But I also remember, too, I used to cycle carbs. So in a sense, you can kind of say I was refeeding without really fully understanding what it meant or how to do it, basically.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know there have been carb cycling articles. I think if you track that back into the 90s, correct me if I'm wrong, dudes.
Mm-hmm.
And Brad, you used to work with Skip. I know Skip LaCour did like the skip loading thing for his actual like peak week, but did he have like days where you would load during preps or or carb cycling or anything like that?
No, none of that. It was just a continuous Well, the way that I arranged it was I just had a meal plan, and I didn't track calories. I didn't track body weight. I don't even know what my body weight was in my first competition.
Yep.
We just had a meal plan, and then it would just, I'm sure if you track the calories, they just slowly went downward. You know what I mean? Because you had a meal plan, and after 2 weeks, you would take away half a cup of oatmeal.
Yeah.
Do that for 2 weeks, take away, a scoop of protein in one meal. You know what I mean? So no, it was just constant calorie restriction, reducing every 2 weeks.
Yep. Yeah. It's interesting because I think for pretty much as far back as the articles I was aware and I read, which would have been like the early 2000s, and then even when I read old stuff or found books or things like that, if you go back to, man, I want to say even like Fred Hatfield used to talk about the zigzag diet and the ISSA. That goes way back, Dr. Squat. And there has always been in kind of the physique community that I've been aware of certain voices, so they've been louder at different times, basically saying, hey, sometimes to break a plateau, you need to zag versus zig, or you need to eat more. And I think there's always, of course, been plenty of people who just are like, hey, if I'm plateaued, I just eat less. But it's always been kind of something that the bodybuilding community has had in their tool bag collectively. And this is one of those cool things where in the research, we've basically, like if you look at bodybuilding research, when the term refeed comes around, or cheat meals or cheat days, or even diet breaks now in a physique context, they always reference, hey, this is what people are already doing, and we're trying to figure out why they think it works, or maybe it doesn't work. We're not sure, but why? And that's one of those interesting things. And I think there was a point where I would say the whole quote unquote evidence-based community was a little less savvy, and they kind of believed like if there wasn't research to back something up, it's not real, it doesn't exist, or it's BS, or it's a myth. People were like, refeeds are a myth. And I'm like, well, there's no research on them. We have some pretty shitty mechanistic data, but man, everyone who implements refeeds seems to see a benefit, whether that's letting go of water, whether that's glycogen replenishment, making you look better, whether it's just improved training quality, or whether it's just your mood picks up, or all the above. I think that's something that we've seen benefits from. So I guess I want to ask you guys, because this is before you started really doing serious coaching, in your first prep where you started to use refeeds, what kind of differences did you notice compared to when you weren't using them?
The first thing that I noticed, because the very first time I ever had a refeed was in 2008. Because in 2008, I just followed my traditional approach of just dropping calories. And I purposely used a refeed because, lo and behold, I was shredded, getting ready for another bodybuilding competition, the second one, and I had to do my RKC certification, the Russian Kettlebell Challenge, which is a grueling 3-day course. They basically try to break you in 3 days. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this course, taking in 1,400 calories and having them, basically try to purposely break us doing, their goal was 150 swings every day, broken up into, different segments of teaching. But I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it. So I went ahead and purposely made a specific meal plan, and I packed all my food in ice chests and everything that, had a lot of carbohydrate in it. It had like oatmeal and almonds and raisins and, all weighed out and measured in the Tupperware containers like you typically do see bodybuilders do. And the biggest thing that I remember was basically how well I performed during that RKC certification. My performance shot through the roof because I was over prepared for that. I mean, I had done hundreds of swings. I passed the kettlebell snatch challenge like at least 3 or 4 times. But I mean, I had to drag myself as I was getting prepared, for that certification. And I with probably just that extra energy, on board, I performed really good. Like my training was gruelingly hard, and I breezed through that test. And so that was the biggest thing that I noticed right off the bat. Now, ironically, the next weekend I did my second bodybuilding competition when I won my pro card. And I didn't know it at the time, but looking at things in retrospect, I got more lean. Now, again, I didn't track body weight. I have no idea if I gained weight. I have no idea if I lost weight. But all I know is that I looked dramatically leaner that weekend that I was going through the kettlebell challenge, and then also the following weekend when I competed on stage with my pro card.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the two obvious things that, I can honestly say that were noticeable. I wish I had more data, because that was kind of I won't say my infancy of bodybuilding prep, but it was definitely early on. But yeah, those are the two things that I noticed in me myself. Now, in other clients, we got to talk about, we can't go through a podcast without talking about poop, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've got to talk about poop in every single podcast. But I'm sure, Jeff, you've seen it too, and probably you, Eric, as well. I mean, how many times do we give somebody a couple of refeeds? They haven't pooped in 3 or 4 days, and all of a sudden, things start moving.
Yep. I definitely noticed that personally and with clients. I mean, there is, so just so everyone knows who's listening, a normal bowel movement frequency is anywhere from 3 times a week on the low end to daily. And that's all within the realm of normal. And I'm definitely closer to 3 times a week in prep, and almost always after or during refeeds is where those are typically distributed. And then I'm getting closer to 1 time a day, but not always when I'm fully recovered in the off season. And I do think that the higher calorie intake plays a big role there.
Yeah, and whether it's there's actually food in your intestine, or it just stimulates peristalsis, either way, one of those two things is happening, if not both.
Mm-hmm.
What were you gonna say, Jeff?
I was just to say, so prior to 2011, when it was more structured refeeds, when we kind of knew more or less the reasons why we were doing it. So back prior to my old preps, in the early to mid 90s, when I was carb cycling, it wasn't I wasn't thinking hey, I'm doing this for performance or recovery. It was more for the aesthetics of it. That was the only thing I was paying attention to. It's kind of interesting. I remember training back then. It didn't matter if I was feeling good, not good. I'd always have more times than not really good workouts just through mental will. So I wasn't paying attention to those things. I wasn't educated enough on it. So my thought was just okay, I look flat on these low carb days. Let me eat some more carbs for 2 or 3 days. Now I look better. And it was more okay, cool, I look good. Because I was fearful of being flat all the time back then. And that's probably why I wasn't, shredded back then, fully shredded, because I was just fearful of looking too flat. So that was just the big thing I noticed early on was eat less carbs. I look worse and worse as the days go on. I look flatter and flatter, start filling glycogen back up, and I start looking better and better. And of course, confidence would get boosted because of that. But that was early on, that was my only thing I was really kind of assessing and really paying attention to, because I was kind of oblivious to everything else. And then in 2011, that was the first season where I incorporated 1 refeed a week. And if you recall, Eric, you guys would freak out because I would have these ginormous refeeds where I would be taking in anywhere between 500 to 800 grams of carbs. And you guys are stop, don't do that. But what I was noticing was I look far superior the next day. Energy's a lot better. And just mentally, I'm okay, I'm good. I can continue on with this dieting thing another 6 days. And just by looking at my own data, tracking, weigh-ins and all that, by the time I got to the next refeed, even though the one prior was large, I was seeing new lows on the scale. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of my early experiences with the refeeds. And it wasn't until later preps where we started dabbling with multi-day refeeds, things like that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think back to my 09 prep, where, because in 07, I'm remembering back now the way I was doing it. I was basically just having one untracked meal a week on my own, and I was having some very, very limited um, refeeds based on, I think, Lane's article. And I was picking at both my low days and my high days and adding cardio kind of indiscriminately every week. And eventually it's like I had low days and then less low days, but I really wouldn't call them a traditional refeed. And a similar kind of thing happened in '09 to where I had these 2 days that were slightly higher, maybe by 100 grams of carbs. And then every adjustment that was macronutrient based was to all days. So my refeeds dropped, my low days dropped, and very quickly I had what most would not consider. I was in a deficit pretty much on all days. You'd
So
think.
you really weren't having a refeed looking back in hindsight.
Exactly. And then I think I got stuck around 190 for months. And I made 2 periods of progress. One was after the silver and black, which I did in April, and I went out and had a big burrito afterwards. And then I dropped down into the 180s. And then I looked better at the NGA show. And then that time I had like a big meal, not just the burrito, and then breakfast the next day. And I made big progress. And I noticed that after each show, we kept on top of a front load as well. I would have these celebratory meals that were untracked, and I would make the week, like after all the bloat had cleared away, I would make more progress than I had been the whole time. And it was so startling that eventually, like Lane picked up on it, and I think for the last couple shows, and Berto started taking me on into September, it became a more regular thing, and it really started to work. Like I remember Berto would just wait until I looked disgustingly flat, and then he'd give me like, here's 150 grams of carbs, and then I played with a mini cut in the off season, and I tried not doing refeeds and with refeeds. And when I had the refeeds, the scale would just continuously go down. And then I took that information into 2011, and I had, I think I had one small day and one big refeed day that I wouldn't touch the whole time. And that was the first prep, my third season, where I lost continuously the whole time. Like my averages went down. And '07 and '09, it was kind of like I just had to like smash through the wall and crush myself. And in the process, like I tore my hamstring in '09. And I found like, I looking back on it now, I think it's a combination not only of aiding my energy expenditure and keeping me in a better state physiologically, but a lot of it I think also helps me dissipate water. And I think what I was doing before was I was making unnecessary cuts when I wasn't actually plateaued, and just really, really running myself into the ground and seeing my NEAT just drop, in response to the cardio I was doing, and kind of plateauing myself there and just getting all jacked up. So it's interesting. And I think all of that was very, very, like, it seemed like voodoo at the time, because I think back then, especially us sciencey dudes, were like, the math has to add up.
Well, yeah, and I remember people would go like, you give them a couple of refeeds back then, and they're like, "Oh, are you sure we should be doing this? We're gonna stall progress out." And you go, "No, let's just do it because it'll make you feel better." Yada yada yada. And then they do it, they run it, and then they get that whoosh, and they're like,
"Yep,
you're a wizard."
Yes.
like that was the famous line back then. Hey, Eric's a wizard, Brad's a wizard, Jeff's a wizard.
Yep. And I don't think, honestly, until the last 3 years have we had a reasonably decent theoretical understanding in the scientific literature to why and how this stuff might make sense. And I think that's really interesting. Like, I've only been trying to help connect the dots with, hey, what we call diet fatigue, what we call, the contest prep blues, or all the crappy experiences we experience. It's kind of like, if you look at other research, like if you look at overtraining syndrome, the combination of aerobic and anaerobic, and if you look at low energy availability or relative energy deficiency in sport, REDS, when you look at those symptoms, you see those as basically the whole description of what we experience. Being in an acute state of having very, very low energy compared to the amount that we need to do the high energy output we're doing as a contest prepper, doing cardio and training. It describes most of those shitty experiences. So there's that acute component that a refeed, quote unquote, fixes. And I think really interesting. Like, another big thing I noticed when this is more from coaching, was once we started doing refeed and especially diet breaks, my female clients would keep their menstrual cycles a lot longer, and they'd kind of like sputter out and then come back, and sputter out and then come back. And that's one of the biggest markers of low energy availability in women, is that you start to see oligomenorrhea, or like irregular menstrual cycles leading into amenorrhea, the cessation of menstrual cycles. And that is a downstream effect of kind of the whole system being managed, like related to leptin, related to thyroid output, related to your hormonal status. But essentially, there's all these acute receptors and sensors in our body that tell us our current energy status, what we're eating, and there's both a energy component to it and a time component. And I think that's a really interesting thing too, because I've noticed that obviously diet breaks seem to be more effective for refeeds. It's kind of like a magnified effect. And in my experience, 2 or 3 day refeeds also seem to be a lot more effective than a single cheat meal or a 1 day where you eat a lot more. Like, you look good temporarily, but I find the plateau comes back a lot faster. I don't know if that mirrors what you guys have seen.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what probably pushed me over the edge into the multiple day refeed was, Eric, when you were sharing a couple of studies by is it Verity that you say it? Verity, and then there was another one that was Harvey, I believe, where they the participants, if I remember right, they lost the same amount of weight, but yet the people with the multiple day refeeds lost more of their weight from fat. And a lot of times,
those are the first hints.
That's all I need is just some sort of a tangible, visible, result that really fits with our sport, because that's what it's all about. We want to get up there on stage with the most amount of muscle we can and the least amount of fat. And we talked, a few times about big breakthroughs that we've all had in coaching. That was a big breakthrough for me when I started incorporating 2 day, and sometimes 3 day, refeeds for a lot of folks. It seemed like mortal people were getting elite shredded. You know what I mean? And that was a big breakthrough for me. And then, of course, all this other anecdotal stuff that we all kind of knew through our own experience and through working with clients and seeing what happens after, like you said, after you peak and then have a celebratory meal after your show. All of that stuff started happening as we're in prep. You know what I mean? And that was a huge breakthrough. That really was. And then, of course, now we have more actual evidence base. I mean, it's still in its infancy, but we have a little bit more. And like you said, now the math is starting to make sense. Now the math is starting to add up, and it's kind of like, it's not really wizardry. We don't have to sacrifice the lamb in order for the sun to come up the next morning. There's an actual, scientific fact that the sun is going to come up, and so now we're kind of seeing, why these things are happening.
No, I liked actually, and first of all, you nailed those citations. Harvey et al., I want to say 2012, I think, was a 5 and 2 study. There's a number of these, and you've actually done this playing with it for your little like off-season cuts that you stayed to keep lean, where 5 days of the week they weren't dieting, they're eating around maintenance, and then 2 days of the week they had big deficits. And I think the Harvey specific study, they also utilized the high protein approach. So it was an imperfect fit for the idea of refeeds, but it was really all we had at the time. And so they were doing basically 2 days a week, or eating like 500 calories, and they compared that to a similar approach where all 7 days were daily caloric restriction, and they had a high protein approach. And in that specific study, they did have better lean body mass retention, if I recall correctly. Or might have been better fat loss. I can't remember off the top of my head. And then Verity is a review of a bunch of different studies like that, including alternate day fasting, 5 and 2 diets, etc. And they found slightly better lean body mass retention in the groups doing intermittent caloric restriction. Now, interestingly enough, there have been a number of additional reviews like that, and some of them have found no significant difference overall, but it's tough to make much of that because they're combining all these different approaches to what we would call nonlinear dieting, But I think what's really interesting now is we've got some super specific research. This is in review, but it has been presented at ISSN conference by Dr. Campbell and his lab. They took the 5 and 2 approach we're used to, 5 low days, 2 high days during a deficit, and they compared it to 7 straight days, I think for 8 weeks in already lean people. So doing resistance training experience. So it's like, it would be like taking a snapshot of 8 weeks out of the early phase of a prep, I think would basically be what you're looking at. And they found greater muscle retention and a better preservation of metabolic rate in the group that used the 2-day refeed on the weekend. And that seems to make a lot of sense too, because like I was mentioning on the time course component, if you go back way into like the late 90s, early 90s, and we look at some of the original research that led us towards this whole low energy availability idea, a lot of it was them trying to figure out, okay, why do we see the menstrual cycle shut down in athletic women sometimes? And it often goes with the female athlete triad. If you're not familiar with the female athlete triad, that is disordered eating, loss of menstrual cycle, and then low bone mineral density. And it's typically seen in athletes who have a very high energy output and are also trying to maintain a relatively lean physique. So endurance athletes, very common. You'll now see it, of course, in bodybuilding women, and then also in CrossFit competitors. So anyway, they're trying to figure out, okay, what is the specific mechanism that's causing this? Is it that because they're lean? Is it because they have an unbalanced diet? If they're following some kind of fad diet? Is it because they are just restricting energy? What's the cause? And they found that it did have to do directly with just having a low energy intake relative to the output. And that there was also a time course component. So in these interesting studies, one, what they did was they had people for 3 days be completely fasted, and then had a big refeed following that. And another one, they were on a very low energy diet for I think 5 days, and they had a couple days then going back to maintenance calories. And if you look at the net energy balance, like the deficit and the surplus from the low days or the fasting days compared to the surplus days or the maintenance days, they were about the same in these 2 studies, even though they're a different time course. But in the one study where they had 3 days fasted and then one big refeed, we're talking like, a normal sized woman eating 4,500 calories for a day. The menstrual cycle hormones indicative of regularity, so their luteinizing hormone pulsatility, it didn't come back to normal. But in the study where they had multiple days in maintenance, that's when it started to return. So it wasn't just the total amount of calories, but also our body has some sensing mechanism of probably related to, if you think about it from like a survival standpoint, like the food needs to be available, not just here right now, big amount, then goes away. So that's really interesting to me, because now we start to learn a little bit about, if we understand the mechanism, then like you said, we're not sacrificing goats and praying for the sun to come up. We can actually think, all right, well, if we understand the mechanism, what's the best way to do this? Well, these cheat meals or these huge one-day refeeds, they probably do something, but they're not fixing the low energy availability. They're definitely going to replenish glycogen. We know that from an endurance carb loading studies. We know that from just doing a backload, right? And looking great on stage and feeling better that day. We know that'll improve our training. We'll probably get better sleep that night, a bunch of things. But if we want to actually see some of these hormonal adaptations to being in an energy deficit, we've got to be out of energy deficit for a little bit. And that's when we start to go, okay, well, I don't want to push that too far. Like one thing that I've seen so many bodybuilders talk about, right, is that they'll do a show. Maybe they have another one on the horizon, and they'll have a big binge meal out that night. They'll go nuts Saturday night, but they'll get back on the diet on Sunday, and they're fine. But the bodybuilders who report going nuts on Saturday and Sunday, they notice they backslide a little bit, and there seems to be some consequence to it, So we know that if you just go on this massive surplus for multiple days, obviously you will start to gain fat. It's not magic forever. That's just, out of our hands. But yeah, there seems to be some interplay where we can try to get the least amount of downsides with the most amount of upsides. And at least in that study that Campbell did, we see that can result in better maintenance of metabolic rate and potentially greater muscle maintenance over time. And I would say that's probably what I've seen. I know I've seen higher stage weights when I've done more consistent refeeds and diet breaks in athletes compared to previous years. So yeah.
That's me right there. from 2009 to 2011 was 10 pounds. I mean, it wasn't solely because of the refeeds, but it was a big part of the picture. And then in 2014, so from 2011, I was 1 refeed a week. 2014, that's where I went to the 5 and 2 system.
Yep.
And then basically I looked about, well, I should say the stage weight was about the same, but I looked a little bit bigger and a little bit leaner. And then this last prep, it was, again, a lot of 5 and 2s. There was some 6 and 1s in there, but even, there was some 4s and 3s that I ran.
Yeah.
And even with my athletes, what I'm noticing is, I should say this, as a coach, I've kind of taken it more of an artistic approach to refeeds. Like, okay, I'm going to do 5 and 2. Like, maybe I start a system with an athlete. We'll run 5 and 2 at first, but depending on progress, depending on, where their training is, the recovery, life events, things like that. I'm like, okay, maybe this week it's a 6 and 1. Maybe, 2 weeks from now it might be a 4 and 3, just depending, where they're at. So I've learned to basically kind of auto-regulate their refeeds for them in a way, based on their feedback and what we're seeing and those types of things.
Really quick favor, guys. If you enjoy these shows and have been a listener for quite some time, we would really, really, really appreciate it if you could take the time to give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your preferred podcast app may be. Having lots of ratings and audience feedback makes our show become more visible across multiple platforms, and it supports our mission of helping as many people as we can to be the best athletes, coaches, and lifting enthusiasts that they could possibly be. So if you're not driving and wouldn't be dangerous, pause this thing right now and give us an honest review over on your podcast app, and we would love you even more than we already do. Thanks for taking the time, and we hope you enjoy the show.
I was reflecting back in my early days of coaching females, and it seemed like it never failed, because I knew that I knew instinctively that body fat on women really did not cause, like really low body fat, didn't cause the absence of the menstrual cycle. What do you call it?
Oligomenorrhea means like not in a regular pace, and then amenorrhea, like amoral without morals. Amenorrhea without menstrual cycle.
I knew
Grammar with Eric Helms.
That body fat didn't have anything to do with amenorrhea, because it never failed. If I front-loaded a female athlete for peak week, Friday they'd have their menstrual period. And then, of course, that's bad because they're competing Saturday usually. But it seemed like it never failed, And so that told me right there. I mean, other than anecdotal evidence, I had nothing to prove that body fat had or really low body fat had very little to do with amenorrhea. And it's, as you were talking, and you were talking about how, the food availability affects hormonal activity more than anything. That was something that I suspected early on. And I mean, to this day, we can usually keep that menstrual cycle somewhat intact throughout the prep. It may not be regular, but a lot of times I'm kind of proud of when we get a female athlete really, really lean, really, really shredded, and we've been able to kind of somewhat keep their menstrual cycle regular. So it just kind of proved early on what I knew is now something that through evidence.
Well, let me ask you if you've this anecdotal question, because I do think there's more to explore with the body fat thing. Have you seen that in the gals who you give the front load, menstrual cycle comes back, and let's say they have multiple shows, and then you go back to a diet, does the menstrual cycle go away pretty quick again after that? How long does it hold on?
Good question. Let me think for a second here, because I would say most recently in a female that I coached to multiple shows, again, it was very, very sporadic. Like, I remember it seemed to disappear for like 3 weeks. And it was kind of like, well, you know what? We held on to it for, I'm sorry, not 3 weeks. Scratch that. 3 months. It disappeared. And so it was kind of like, well, you know what? We tried as best we could to hold on to it, but it's a thing of the past. Let's get through this last show. Let's get you as shredded as we can, and know that it'll come back in the recovery process. But we went through a diet break, I want to say about 5 or 6 weeks prior to her last show. Sure enough, the very next month, the menstrual cycle showed back up again.
Right.
I don't know if that answers the question, but I know that it disappeared for about 3 or 4 months. Diet break, a month later, it came back.
Yeah.
And not only did it come back, like it came back hard, like hit her hard emotionally, you know. And it was kind of like that 3 month period where it disappeared. It kind of made for it.
Here's 3 months worth of menopausal symptoms.
All at once.
No fun.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let me correct me if I'm characterizing this wrong. It probably took a couple months of contest prep before it started to dissipate and go away. Then it was gone for 3 months. Did a show. Diet break. A month later, then it comes back.
It held on for longer than that, to be honest with you. Like, it held on for a good 6 months of prep.
Nice.
And then it was kind of like it disappeared for like 3 or 4 months.
Was it during that point you're like kind of like a digging phase, like things were getting pretty challenging, getting leaner, lower food levels?
I can't say that for sure because we did do some shows in there. So we probably had some peaking and, you know, at least probably 2 or 3 high days grouped together for a peak and then a celebratory meal, you know, probably that night. Well, yeah, I can't say for sure that it was a digging phase because I do know we did shows in there.
So that actually lines up with what I think is going on and where we need more research is that body fat isn't the primary mechanism. Sure, it's what you do to get to that lean level, but at a certain point it does start to have like additive effects or permissive effects or something like that. Because like obviously if there was a 6 month period before it went away, she was dieting during that phase. She was getting leaner and leaner. And then at a certain point, it didn't sound like you went through like a hardcore digging phase right at the end of that 6 month period. There were some cumulative effects. And then when the refeed came back, it came back. When the diet break occurred, the menstrual cycle came back and then probably went away again and then came back in the recovery phase. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. So that what that tells me is that yes, the reason why it will dissipate is because of acute low energy availability. But if let's say your chronic energy availability has been low for a long time, and perhaps maybe even if your body fat stores are super low, then it's ready to go away again really, really quickly. And I know that obviously I don't have a menstrual cycle, but in my last prep, maybe not obvious, I mean, but let me for the record, I don't have a menstrual cycle. So what I noticed was that because I started using 1, then 2, then 3 day refeeds, and I had a few diet breaks. On my third and sometimes second day of my refeeds when I had 3 days, and then definitely during my diet breaks, when I was like at classic physique level conditioning, say from like March through May, I would feel damn near off season after a couple days of being in a great position, and that would carry over into the next series of low days, and then I started to feel crappy again. But once I got past June and I was in kind of like peak condition from the show that both you guys were at for the River City Classic onward, basically, I would feel great 2 refeeds in on that day, and then like the first low day, halfway through the day, I'd start to feel like shit. Like it just would not last. And it makes sense because so one of the theorized mechanisms by which our body senses energy availability is leptin. So when we eat food, there is a leptin response acutely. And I think people have probably overemphasized it too much because leptin does seem to respond acutely more to carbohydrate, but energy availability, low energy availability or high energy availability, the correcting of these issues or the cause of these issues seems to be somewhat independent of whether you're on a low or high fat diet. So I think it is probably like total energy because our body does make all kinds of exchanges and substrate manipulations to get us all the stuff we need. We got gluconeogenesis, we've got lactate conversion. We've even seen in fat-adapted endurance athletes that if they deplete glycogen, they'll replenish it, not even eating carbohydrate. So that's just a little aside. So I don't think it necessarily is all about carbohydrates, and because it's probably not all just about leptin, or rather from food. There's also the body fat we have it dictates our leptin level. So someone who's obese actually has a ton, very, very high levels of circulating leptin, and they might actually be leptin resistant, kind of the same way you can get insulin resistant. And if you look at anyone who's super lean and they're not acutely feeding, they're going to have low leptin levels. So one of the master hormones that's related to our body's ability to sense energy is secreted by fat. So if your adipose tissue is rock bottom, while you're eating, things might be hunky-dory, but as soon as you get back into an energy deficit, man, sometimes it'd be if I skipped a meal, like if I had to go 5 hours without eating, or if I went hiking or something like that, it would be like I'd feel great and then I'd just fall right off that cliff and just feel awful again. And I noticed, I've had some clients report that as well, but I think there is definitely a modifying factor that once you get so lean that your body fat is so low where you're not producing much of your own leptin, I think, that's when it can be compounded. Like it's very, very common for sprinters, for example, and I reviewed a study of this on in mass rather. Once they go through the in-season period, their training volume ramps up, and they're actually trying to maintain a lower body fat because it gives them an advantage, power to weight ratio, so they can run faster. That's when they start to experience these low energy availability symptoms. And then when they get into the quote unquote off season, and their body fat gets higher, it starts to get back to normal. So you see, it's not the average sprinter who is able to have a totally normal menstrual cycle among females in the peak of their season. And I think that's probably a knock-on effect as well because they get pretty damn lean. So, yeah.
Eric, let me ask you a question on energy expenditure, especially like after a refeed. Because what you just described, where you're feeling pretty darn good for a couple days, and then as you get leaner and leaner and leaner, it's like that first low day. You feel like crap, right?
Yep.
How much of that do you think, or do you know maybe, have to do with energy expenditure?
A great deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So like the term low energy availability, that's actually mathematically something we can quantify. So there's actually, like math to determine one's energy availability. It's imperfect math, which I'll get to in a second, but it is at least held up in a relatively homogeneous sample when you study that sample and you look at these relationships. So energy availability, very simply, is your energy intake minus your exercise energy expenditure divided by your lean body mass. So you might get like an energy availability of, say, 40 kcals per kilogram of lean body mass. Okay. Now, in the original studies where they tried to determine what was the cause of the loss of the menstrual cycle, they used sedentary, overweight women. And then they calculated their energy expenditure from exercise. And they calculated the energy availability, and they found that pretty reliably, once they dropped below around 30 kcals per kilogram of an energy availability per kilogram of lean body mass, that's when they started to see irregularities in menstrual cycle, LH pulsatility got off, and sometimes amenorrhea. Now, in the research on athletes, you get a much broader range, and that's because you don't have this homogeneous population of sedentary women. Now, you're dealing with very small excursions, a very small standard deviation of what their total energy expenditure is. So you can be like, oh, yeah, it's 30. Well, in athletes, you can see these issues anywhere between 30 to 45, because sometimes you might have someone who's sedentary in life, or they might have a pretty active life, and they might be just weight training 3 days a week, or they might be weight training 6 days a week and doing cardio. So that's why you kind of get this much more greater variability. So I don't think it's correct to say, hey, if you go below 30, you got a problem. In the original research you did, but the most important part of that research is that it shows there's a relationship, not just how much you're eating, but how much you're eating relative to how much you're expending for energy. Because I think the way our body sees it, if that's a poor analogy, but it's a useful one, I think, is that energy we expend out in the world not taking care of our physiological processes is extra, right? So if we have to do all of this hunting or foraging or other things to survive, which is the way our body operates, because for millions of years that's what we've been doing with it, not just lifting weights for fun, then okay, I've got to make up for that because you're out trying to live. And if you're being more active right now, it's because you're trying to find food. You're either picking berries, or you're out there hunting for a deer. So okay, I need to cut off something else. And if you're out there spending all this time trying to find food, it means you probably don't have enough for a kid. So I don't want you to be fertile, right? So no menstrual cycle for you, and guys, low libido, low testosterone production, probably not going to be having a kid in the middle of prep, right? So energy expenditure is very much a part of energy availability, and you can modify it by doing too much or too little. And this is where I would like refer our listener to some of our discussions on cardio, where we see that once we've got a stable step count, things seem to make a lot more sense, because there's a fair amount of research on how when you modify your cardio energy expenditure, so purposeful energy expenditure from exercise, you will often, not always, see compensation to that to some degree from non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And this is very individual. So like, for example, I don't want anyone to think it's magic, like cardio is pointless. Like if you do it, you're just going to move less outside of the other part of the day. But in a recent study that I saw, I think about 30% of individuals were able to completely negate the cardio they did by seeing NEAT drop. The good news is 70% of individuals are not. That means doing cardio does something, but it's still, in the 70% of individuals, most of them saw an incomplete compensation. So you might be clocking, let's say you're looking at the elliptical, okay, I burned 400 calories a day 3 days a week. I burned 1,200 calories extra. That's not exactly right, because you were going to do something during that half an hour anyway. But let's say it was 1,000 calories extra you calculated, and you're in the 70%, the lucky people who aren't super good at compensating. It probably would still be somewhere between only 40 to 80% of what you expected, because of, that you would have burned those 1,000 calories, but you would have been less fidgety. You would have been more sedentary other parts of the day. You'd be leaning on things. You'd be just not bobbing your head to music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So our bodies are really good at reducing our subconscious energy expenditure in the form of NEAT, so that even though you might be increasing your cardio, your body's trying to affect that other side, because the way that energy availability is determined is based on what are the excess energy requirements that we have compared to our basal metabolic rate or resting metabolic rate requirements for our physiology.
Yeah,
it's a long answer.
I think the part that really is interesting to me is the NEAT aspect of energy expenditure, because I've just here probably in the last year or so, for my own knowledge, I'll have athletes periodically count their respirations in a minute, and they'll typically clock about because they've been doing cardio and they're getting in better shape, so their cardiovascular health is better, but they'll clock about 12, maybe 11, 12, 13 respirations per minute, and then I'll say, okay, we got us a good audit, but later on in the prep, I'll say, okay, let's go ahead and have us a diet break. I want you to take a whole week, and I want you to have high days the whole week. And then the following week, I'll say, okay, let's do another audit. Let's see what those respirations are. And sure enough, they're not a lot higher, but, we're seeing like 15, respirations per minute, where they might have been at like 11. And so to me, I'm thinking to myself, wow, that's a lot of calories. And there's other things that are happening. Some people will just break out in a sweat after being cold their entire prep. They get a week of high days and they're sweating, So then I start thinking about, okay, well, there's the actual tangible things that we're seeing, counting respirations, getting, a sweat and things like that. What about things that we can't see? What about peristalsis of the intestines? Now there's more food there, plus it might be chewing through there faster. And then, like you said, if the hormones are getting more and more regulated, it seems like the endocrine system might be working just a little bit harder. And so that's kind of the aspect I'm wondering if that increase in caloric expenditure, like you just talked about, isn't somewhat affected through an increase in NEAT after those refeeds. You know what I mean? I think that's
I do know what you mean.
Part.
Yeah.
But that's why refeeds are important. I mean, if we're just on low days and we're digging, I mean, think of supply and demand. The demand just is so high. Like, yeah, you're not going to want to get off the couch to even go to the bathroom.
There, yeah.
So, I mean, if you think about, okay, if I could hardly get up to go to the bathroom, what's my training going to be like?
Yep.
What is my overall mood going to be like? Not just, talking about the physical, but the mental, emotional too. So I kind of just like the analogy I like to use, like, if you're a race car racing around the track, for 100 laps, everything gets worn down on the car. You got to bring it in for a pit stop, put some more gas in and put new tires on. And that way you can get back out there on the track and perform. So
it's almost like the track is getting harder over time or more grueling. So you need more pit stops as you go. I think this analogy just popped in my head. Let me know if you guys like it. It's like you're trying to dig to a known location. Like you are like, all right, there is treasure at the bottom of this. That treasure is striated glutes. But it starts with your digging through like mud, then it's clay, and then by the end it's granite.
I like it.
And your shovel is not a great construction. So by the time you're digging into the granite, the shovel's getting worse. And guess what? Yeah. You're a human. You're getting more and more tired, and every stroke of that crappy shovel is tiring you out, and you're having to push harder and strike harder as you get to deeper and deeper ground. And just imagine what it would be like if you could take a break, get out a sharpening stone, sharpen your shovel, and just sit there not hammering against granite. When you go back to it, it will be easier and more effective. And I think that is absolutely happens across multiple domains. Brad, so you were mentioning respiratory rate. And you mentioned the endocrine system, and Jeff, you were talking about the ease of training and how hard training feels and how much get up and go you have to get in the gym and get after it. And these are all domains that are affected. I think we went through basically like 3 phases in the kind of evidence-based explaining this phenomenon approach. The original one, I think we were very focused on the metabolism, right? So you hear the term metabolic damage, metabolic adaptation, metabolic building. And I think we were very, very much focused on the metabolism, specifically like basal metabolic rate. And looking at research, and this is where there was that disconnect initially, where people were like, hey, I'm noticing like hundreds of calorie differences between what I can eat, refeed on, what causes fat loss, what I can diet on with diet breaks on average, how long it takes me to get lean, all this stuff that wasn't matching what we would see in the research, but not in the research on calories versus fat loss versus time, not measuring the same thing, but looking at actual adaptations to metabolic rate. So when you look at true, like we just measured someone on a metabolic cart, you see like 5, maybe 7%, at most 10, 15% reductions in what you'd expect based on their body mass. But that's not the same thing as actual energy expenditure. Basal metabolic rate is a component, the largest component, albeit probably the least adaptive component to our total daily energy expenditure. And now that we've come to find out that energy availability is completely hinged on your energy output relative to what do you need to function physiologically, it really starts to make sense. And when we look at how NEAT operates, I think we used to here's phase 2. So phase 1 is, this doesn't make any sense. Your metabolic rate doesn't adapt that much. These contest prep coaches are they're reporting stuff that's actually their clients just lying about their adherence, right? And we're all going, I don't know. This is a WNBF pro. Like, I don't know if this isn't like, the soccer mom who doesn't really have like goals that are well structured and has no eating habits. This is someone who is getting on stage in 12 weeks and does this for their hobby and is psychotic. So anyway, like it didn't match up. So I think the next phase was we started to realize, maybe NEAT is playing a role here, and only now is the research really catching up. Like, there's a great study when you look at. It was done, I think, back in the 70s. They looked at factory workers and the managers. So they had 4 different categories. There were low, moderate, and high energy expenditure factory workers, just based on what they were doing. And Jeff relates to this. He's actually worked in a factory building cars. Then they had the managers who would sit there, get up, look around. And essentially what they were looking at was sedentary, and then what they classified as low, moderate, and high activity. But in reality, the low, moderate, and high are all what we would consider relatively high activity in modern times when we're so sedentary. And among the 3 factory worker groups, there was a very tight regulation. the more energy expended, the more energy you ate. And all of them had pretty, quote unquote, normal levels of body fat. But then instead of it just being a straight line, this is where we saw the quote unquote J curve. So this is called the J curve relationship between appetite, body mass, and energy expenditure, where when you look at the managers, they were heavier than everybody else, higher in body fat, and eating more despite having the lowest activity. So this tells us that our body is expecting a certain amount of energy expenditure. And if you go way too high, it will regulate it. And if you go way too low, it'll regulate it to increase your energy expenditure for making you weigh more. Because there is survival threats both from being too lean and too heavy. Like if you look at mice, they are really, really, really good at defending a high body weight. They'll prevent themselves from getting fat much better than humans because they're prey animals, right? There's been selection pressure for them not to be fat because now they're juicy, they're tasty, and they're slow, right? So it's not exactly the same in humans. Some of that selection pressure comes from people who are higher in body fat are much more likely to survive disease and famine, because some of the diseases that would affect humans before we had modern medicine would prevent us from being able to eat, or if you ate, you would throw up or have diarrhea. Like think about dysentery or things like that. So if you had energy stores on your body and could hydrate yourself, you could actually survive famine and disease and then be around. So there is this interesting J-curve relationship. And what that means in terms of real terms as far as coaches and athletes care about is that if you're really sedentary, your appetite is poorly regulated. It takes a while for your appetite signals to actually set in and tell you you're full when you eat, so you tend to overeat. And you're going to basically have a higher settling point. But once you get reasonably active, it's good to go. But if you take it too far, that's when you start to see these compensatory drops in NEAT, these compensatory drops in metabolic rate. And although there are like small quantitative drops, like I said, 5, 10, 15% in the amount of energy expenditure from basal metabolic rate, they come from things we don't want to stop working, like your menstrual cycle, the production of testosterone and estrogen. So you see bone mineral density drops. You see losses in muscle mass, which is a more common thing you see in men, which I think is because we see much larger drops in the total amount of testosterone that's there. And women are typically better at maintaining lean body mass, but they have more difficulties with maintaining metabolic rate, energy expenditure, menstrual cycle health, and things like that. There's a case study where it took 1.5 years for a figure competitor after a 24-week prep and recovery to actually get her menstrual cycle back despite gaining weight, probably because she wasn't in a consistently high enough energy availability status. So it's the kind of thing where there's downsides in either way. If you really screw yourself over as a male, you're going to lose more lean body mass. Female might be able to maintain it, but man, it's going to mess you up physiologically in other ways. So yeah, and then that is all very tightly related to your energy expenditure, not just your intake. And I think instead of looking at the energy balance equation as like energy input minus energy output, it's like your energy input directly affects your expenditure, and your expenditure directly affects your intake, especially in free living conditions, which I think is really interesting. So I think with that general philosophical understanding, we can see why it probably makes more sense to take these pit stops, to take that sharpening stone and work on your shovel when you have to get to that phase where you're hammering through granite.
Wow, you were talking really fast there, Eric.
Well, I'm recovered from prep.
That's a lot of NEAT. That jaw was moving pretty fast.
Yeah, at one point you actually had to take a deep breath in and then off you went again.
But I will say this is why we're good coaches, because every other Tuesday it's like, or every other Wednesday now we get to hear Eric do his thing for 10 or 15 minutes.
Well, let's just say, like the energy balance equation, where one side affects the other, I think that is also a back and forth. So depending on how you look at like being an evidence-based practitioner, you could look at the original pyramid I did, the original nutritional pyramid I created in late 2012. And I emphasized, even though it's not it's not macronutrients, it's not energy balance, I emphasized refeeds as something midway up the pyramid as important. Before we really had a lot of research. I'll be honest, looking back at that, I quote unquote knew that refeeds seemed to be really effective, right? And especially when we started doing the 2 and 3 days, that's when I really noticed the benefits. That was right around 2012, if you think about it. Mm-hmm. I just had my 2011 prep, the first time I consistently lost weight. You guys had seen the same success, and our clients were reaping those benefits as well. So I quote unquote knew that these multi-day refeeds were effective, and then I had to basically look for the research to support it. That's not generally how you're supposed to do it, right? You're supposed to just look at all the research on a topic and then make a conclusion.
Yeah.
But now that's the bad way of looking at it. The good way of looking at it is that I had a lot of very robust anecdotal evidence, observational evidence, good data tracked in clients who we've been working with for years, we have a good relationship with, have no reason to obfuscate data, and are, hardworking people with high levels of ability to count their macros, weigh themselves, and give good data, even though it's observational. It's not like a randomized controlled trial. So I'm going, look, there's got to be something going on here, and then I'm looking for ways to explain it. But even back then in 2012, I was making a case for refeeds being pretty important. But realistically, it's only now in like the second edition of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids where someone could just read the research and be like, yeah, it's probably a good idea. Now that we understand what REDS is and that it's a thing in bodybuilders as well, instead of us just calling it quote unquote metabolic damage. Now that we understand that NEAT is actually the most adaptable part of our total daily energy expenditure. And it can be like within someone who's the same body weight with the same lifestyle, it can be 1,000 calorie difference between individuals, which is nuts. Like that's your entire surplus or deficit that you might have even in an aggressive period. And I think once we understand all that, and now where we have the direct applied studies that have been done by like Dr. Bill Campbell, now you can be like, yeah, it's pretty obvious in the research. But the reason why I was able to be quote unquote ahead of the curve, if you will, I think that was because we had all that observational evidence, and that was in large part from you guys. So with that said, considering how much what you guys have done in the trenches has informed some of my ability to interpret the data, how do you guys prescribe refeeds with your athletes?
Jeff, I'll let you go first.
Like I kind of mentioned before, I kind of took that 5-2 system. That's kind of like more of like a template I'd like to use or start with. And even let's say I'm starting an athlete, fresh from prep, where we all know that, body fat's a little bit higher. We can probably get away with not refeeding early on. I still like to incorporate it from the get-go with most people, just so I can develop that system and that structure, and I can get feedback. Like we can just start collecting that data early on. I can see how they respond to that type of system. And then from there, it kind of just depends on, like I mentioned earlier, like how their progress is in regards to, their body weight loss, how they're performing in the weight room, how they're recovering, where their stress levels are at, life events, that type of thing. And then I go a little more auto-regulated based on the feedback that we get with their check-ins week to week. It might be 5-2 the whole way through, or it might be, like I said, 6-1 for a time if we need to, pick up fat loss. If we need to go to 4-3s just to keep, the training going. I have an athlete right now that I just went from a 5-2 to a 4-3 just because he was losing weight too quickly. And so I wanted to stay ahead of the curve as far as fatigue. And I just said, okay, let me go right to 4-3 now, so that way I can keep that performance up, keep that recovery going, so I don't get him in a overly fatigued state where, okay, I have to maybe implement an early diet break. So I want to make sure that I'm, keeping things on point, and that's where that feedback is so valuable when you do those weekly check-ins. But that's basically kind of how I like to roll with refeeds. And then diet breaks, like extended refeeds, it's like more like every 8 to 10 weeks as a generalization. But again, it's more or less based on kind of what we're seeing with the prep. Sometimes it's a little sooner. Sometimes I'll extend it out longer. It just kind of depends on where we're at with the prep, the timeline, as far as show date and that type of thing.
How about you, Brad?
I'm going to give you a really long answer because I'll get into kind of my numbers planning that I do with it. But in summary, it's very, very individualized to the client. And I can honestly say that probably all of my refeeds are different. For the 50 clients I'm working with now compared to the 50 clients that I worked with beforehand, it's all super individualized, and it's based on their data that they give me. So that's the short answer, right? But the numbers wise, basically what I do is I watch their data as it's coming in on our spreadsheet. And the first thing I do is I calculate, okay, what are their maintenance calories for the week right now? Because usually you can figure that out with about 3 or 4 weeks of data pretty easily. It's easiest if they're the same weight the whole time. But even if they drop or gain weight, you can add in the calories, from the weight that they gained or lost, right? And so what I'll do is I'll kind of say, okay, this is their maintenance calories for the week. I want to have 2 days that are above the average that I want for the week, and then I want to have the remaining days for below. So if their maintenance calories are 3,000 calories a day, 21,000 calories a week, if we want to lose a pound a week as our target, I'll go ahead and drop their weekly calories down to, what is that, 17,500? Is that right? 1 pound being 1,500 calories, somewhere in there.
Yeah, not even ish. Exactly, yes.
So I'll just take my 2 high days, my 5 low days, make the 2 high days about maintenance or just above, and then make the low days fit into that weekly total that I want, 18,500, right? And that usually gets us going because they're in a deficit, but we're still getting them 2 refeeds essentially a week, right? And that usually lasts a very long time. It's almost like clockwork. Now, they won't lose a pound every week, but it's like they'll lose 2 pounds, then they'll lose nothing, and then they'll lose a pound and a half, and then they'll lose, a half, something like that. It kind of just is the trend line is such that they go down. But as we all know, eventually that body weight's going to come down to where those calories are now maintenance, right?
Right.
That 18,500, they've lost 5, 6, 7 pounds. Now they're basically taking in their maintenance calories. Easiest if I don't have cardio and expenditure thrown into the mix. You know what I mean? Because that just kind of confounds things. And so at that point, usually I can watch their data as it come in. Guess what? They haven't lost any weight in 3, 4 weeks, right? And so then what I'll do is I'll just kind of average out those calories during that period of time. Because like Jeff said, sometimes I'll take away a diet or I'll take away 1 refeed. Sometimes I'll take that refeed away 1 weekend, and then the next weekend I'll give it back to them, or something like that. But they're stuck there at some point, and so then I'll just do the whole thing again. All right, here's your weekly calories during this sticking point. Let's go ahead and program again a new deficit. Let's calculate things again, and then kind of start over again. Now the fun part is usually when we get the Alberto Nunez's. Right, and it's kind of like, okay, now this person's maintenance calories is like 30,000 a week, because then you almost kind of see what you can get away with,
Yep.
And I actually maybe do 4 high days, and 3 low days, and make it all fit in, you know what I mean? And then watch as that happens, as they go through. But that's essentially how I kind of calculate and make my refeeds happen. Now diet breaks, those are even more fun numbers-wise to program, because sometimes I actually program for weight gain. Like I've got a client that we're going to plan for the month of February for him to gain a pound over the week. Or excuse me, I'm sorry, scratch that, over the month.
Over the month, yep.
Let me take a breath here, get a drink of water. But that's when it's kind of fun, because then you can kind of say, okay, well, you know what? He's still dropping. Let's add those calories back in that he's been dropping in weight loss, kind of figure out what maintenance is for that body weight, give him that for the whole month of February, watch his weight go up. And then sometimes those new diet break numbers become our new dieting numbers, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Because we've reestablished a lot of that metabolic stuff that we talked about. The hormonal level's been kind of more leveled out. The respirations have gone up, sweating's gone up. The heart rate's even gone up, and training performance is better. And it kind of never fails. When they check in and they're giving me a vlog, it's like, yeah, Brad, everything's going really good. Training motivation was at a 6 out of 10, and then it never fails after that month. It's like, yeah, Brad, I got to say that probably, training motivation is about 10 out of 10, and life energy and motivation is like about 8 out of, speaking faster. Their mannerisms are back and things like that. So then if we did gain a pound during that month, we can break it down into 4 weeks. We can say, okay, this was the surplus. Let's go from that and kind of reset things again. So I know that's a long, drawn-out way, but I basically do that for every single client. The ones that get by at 12,000 calories a week, usually those are smaller humans, obviously. And then obviously those smaller humans, now we got to start talking about cardio, because I really don't want those people taking in 8,500 calories a week,
Yeah.
So then we got to start adding in a little bit of cardio in there. So I know that was kind of a long, drawn-out answer, but hopefully that kind of gets the point across.
No, I think that's really helpful, because I think a lot of people who are new to using refeeds, it's very difficult to use them in an intuitive or reactive kind of way. So giving them the framework to work from is really helpful. And anyone who's read the nutrition pyramid, that's pretty much exactly we recommend there. And then just kind of going from 1 to 2 to 3 refeeds as one gets leaner throughout a longer prep. And I really like how you brought up incorporating refeeds into it, diet breaks into it, and how sometimes the diet break calories can become the dieting calories. I think the only thing that I would add, like what I do slightly differently, is that when someone stalls for me, and it does often concur with, a fair amount of weight loss, and we think, okay, this is your new maintenance. And at least at that moment, it probably is their new maintenance. But what I think everyone needs to remember, based on this whole energy balance being a reactive two-way equation, is that maintenance is a moving target. And your maintenance can be a range at any body weight, depending on what your body fat is and how acutely you've been refed, et cetera. And whether or not you're in a surplus or not, your maintenance will either go up or down a little bit to match it. So one of the things that I like to do is, once I actually plateau, instead of recalculating everything, if I've got the time and I've got the client buy-in, I'll throw a diet break at them. And then I'll try to go back to what they were previously stalled on and see if I can get away with, if you will, dieting on what was their old maintenance after a diet break. And most of the time, I can get at least a week or two more progress, and sometimes it'll go for another month, which I think is pretty cool. And it's kind of like we're just preventing that drain circling from happening at too fast a rate. So that's the only thing that I would add. Since Berto's not here, and since he did start handling my diet breaks and refeeds my last prep, I'll chime in a little bit about what he does. I think he works with a similar resultant framework, but he likes to do a lot of, we're going to push until I see you looking visually better, or I see a scale weight drop, depending on where we're at in your prep, which one of those metrics is a more reliable indicator of progress. And then I'll refeed you. And I will refeed you until I think you look better. And for him, he has a good enough eye where he can see whether someone's like looking inflamed and water retaining and full. And he likes to see the combination of not holding on to a lot of inflammation-based water retention, feeling good, subjectively, all the stuff that Brad talked about, and also seeing, the visual improvement. So I think the combination of all those things are what he likes to see. And then we do the whole thing again. So I think that's a really, really interesting way to approach it. And there does become a point in prep where the scale, the number change you're looking for on the scale is much smaller than the subjective visual change we're trying to see. And
and that's where I like to auto-regulate things a bit more. So I might, like I said, start out with a 5 and 2 system. Like you're thinking of like a 7-day system, but sometimes that 7 days turns into a 10-day, 11-day, 9-day, kind of like Berto, like what Berto does. Kind of just goes based off of what he's seeing. So like early on for me, it's more like a system, but it eventually ends up being more like I'm auto-regulating these things based on feedback.
Yeah, that's exactly. So I remember there was specifically mid-February, end of February, I was basically just starting to get into, you could step on stage and you wouldn't be, you would belong even though you're not shredded, right? Mm-hmm. I was, 8 weeks out from my first show or something like that. And I reported into Berto, and I had been at a conference in Australia, so my energy expenditure was a lot higher than it was normally. And he was like, "Are you sure you did 2 refeeds?" I was like, "Yeah, I did my 2 refeeds." He's like, let's do a third. You look flat." I was like, "Oh, okay." That's one example where it's just like the refeed didn't do what it was supposed to do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward 7 weeks later, and I'm on my 10th low day in a row, no refeeds, because he hasn't seen the visual change he wanted on the other side of it. You don't look flat enough. You don't look like you've gotten enough leaner. You've metabolically you've shifted your energy expenditure down enough to where we got to keep pushing for a bit. So I think that's exactly what you do have to do once you start having I would say it's a luxury if you're an experienced coach and you have the eye, because then you can make it much more individualized. But I can say that can be probably a scary thing if you're coaching yourself, where it's very difficult to be as objective as you can in those self-subjective analyses, or if you're kind of a newer coach. If you're a newer coach, I would say just probably stick with kind of a system. Like I created one for the PTC Collective course. Like, hey, start with 1 refeed a week, third of the way, go to 2 refeeds, last third, go to 3 refeeds. And then at each one of those points, when you're going to go from 1 to 2 to 3 refeeds, do a diet break to break it up, And that's a very reasonable template. And, the reality is that
I would take notes too. Like, if you're a coach and you're having people check in on this, then have them take photos the day before refeeds, the day of refeeds, the day after, so you can see visual changes amongst those refeeds. Also get that feedback from as far as like energy levels, how performance is going, their recovery, that type of thing, stress levels, like all that stuff, all that data that you can collect, it can help you learn how to adjust that person.
Yep.
And the more you do that, the better you get as a coach from an artistic standpoint of knowing kind of how to manipulate people. Because we can numbers are great, but they don't always tell the whole story. I can look at a spreadsheet and go, everything looks terrific on the spreadsheet, the numbers are all lining up. But if this person's telling me things that aren't lining up with that data, you may have to adjust based off of that versus just numbers. So they both go hand in hand. You need both sides of that, in my opinion.
I love this. I feel like, Brad, you need like a chalkboard behind you with like equations, and then Jeff, you need like a beret. I want to see Jeff with an easel behind a beret. We can have the science and the art of this, or the analytical, the objective or subjective. I think you guys are both bringing great points. But sorry, Brad, go ahead.
Well, trust me, I like in my spreadsheet, I'm like, okay, what would Brad do here? And I'll crunch some numbers. So I am a numbers guy, but I also do the artistic side, and I know Brad does the same. We've learned from each other over the years, no doubt.
Yeah, and on the artistic side, a lot of times, our clients will kind of say, well, what is it that you see here? What do the numbers say, or what is it that you're seeing on my physique that leads you to believe this? And I'm like, gosh, you know what? It's a gut feeling. That's all I can tell you. I can't tell you numbers wise. I can't tell you what I'm seeing on the physique. It's my gut telling me a combination of these things is what we need to do here. And that's kind of my artistic way of describing what it is that tells me we're doing this.
And there's actually nothing wrong with that. So there's what I would say is a pretty well supported theory of skill development, of mastery, and it goes through basically 4 phases. And this is learning any skill. Maybe not perfectly applied to motor skills. That's actually a 3. Anyway, this doesn't matter. So before I get into motor theory, so there is a model for mastery of a skill, and it starts with unconsciously doing it incorrectly, and then consciously doing something incorrectly. Like you have to really think about it, and then you get to the point where you're competent. And that's when you're consciously doing it correctly. But when you look at a true expert, or someone who has accumulated their, quote unquote, 10,000 hours or however long it was, but they really know what the hell they're doing, and they have all this, because our brains are essentially very complicated algorithms in some way. Like we're really, really good at, especially when we're paying attention, seeing patterns and creating associations. That's why you can get PTSD, right? Like if you were abused as a kid, and someone comes at you in the right way, you can feel like you're a child again and react in that way that you would try to survive in that environment. A little bit of a morbid example, but the point is, we're great at pattern recognition and associations. That can be problematic for humans, but can also be very helpful if it's intentional. And like what we're talking about here is, you guys have had 30 to 40 athletes for a decade, and when you're seeing these relationships, you can tell, you probably know, or you at least know what happens most often and what has been most successful over time. And in absence of other data, why wouldn't you use that? And you can't necessarily explain that to the client. Well, back in 2014 was the first time I noticed that Tom Smith, on his 16th week of prep, they pulled that Excel sheet and then repeat that 15 times over the next 6 years. That's why we're doing this. No, you just go, you know what? This is just what feels right. And I think some of the more analytical people out there will think, oh, no, you're just guesswork. That's voodoo. It's bullshit. It's not evidence-based. But that's not the way human brains work, you know? You do get intuition is just, it's not voodoo, it's not magic, it's not BS. It's just the overall explanation for this history of pattern recognition we have. And it's not that, and it's also totally valid for you to ask your coach, hey, why are you doing this? In fact, you should, and they should give you an answer that's honest, but they might give you that answer, and that's okay, in my opinion. Yeah. Another cool thing that you brought up, Jeff, you were mentioning paying attention and seeing all these observations. A side benefit to using refeeds is that you can figure out when you look best relative to having onboarding calories and carbs, and sometimes reducing cardio, depending on what we're doing on our refeeds, which is basically your peak week strategy in a nutshell. Yeah. You know, some people, they look good as soon as you start feeding them. Other people, they look good a few days after. They have what Cliff Wilson would call a softer load look. So when you're loading food and calories and carbs, it's not just whether you're spilled over or whether you're full. You can't even really tell that until like that transitional period has dissipated. You know, and that's just like how quickly do you metabolize food? You know, how much sodium was in it? How much fiber was in it? Are you bloated? Are you retaining water? Like, do you drink enough so that you're peeing regularly? But you need like anywhere from a few hours to a few days in certain people before you can tell if they are actually effectively carved up and they look good. And so, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's something that I did this prep. That's something Jeff did this prep. And that's something we do with our clients is we'll typically set up a carb up strategy based on when you look good relative to your refeeds, which I think is a really, really important, nice side benefit that competitors get from using refeeds in their diet.
Yeah, because I usually have athletes, you know, like I said, just give me photos the day prior, day of, day after, maybe even 2 days after, just to kind of see how they're looking, not just once, but actually twice, like morning and night. So I can kind of see without the food in them in the morning, I can see all the food in the evening and in multiple days, and kind of just compare visually where I think maybe that best look is. And of course, we try to duplicate that. And well, that's a hard thing to do when you can't control every single variable of someone's life all the time, but you try your best with what you're seeing in front of you to kind of duplicate that.
Well said. And I think it would be remiss of us not to talk about potential downsides of refeeds. For one, I just want to reemphasize that it's not magic. Like if you try to refeed too much, too long, or too high, I don't really like to use large surpluses on my refeeds. For the most part, I'm just trying to get them out of a negative energy balance and a low energy availability status. I think some people will take it too aggressive and set themselves back, or at least just slow down their progress to a degree that's not necessarily worth it. You know, and I've also seen people who they get psychologically stressed out by refeeds. They see them differently. They might be coming from that cheat meal or cheat day perspective, and refeeds are now this binge trigger. And I think for me, I've seen huge changes just if I can get the perspective of the person to change. It's not the day to go out and change all the qualitative aspects of your diet. This isn't the day. I mean, yes, you could go out and eat, especially if you're more experienced competitor and you know how to behave at restaurants and you have a lot of baseline supportive dietary habits. But if it's like a first or second season competitor or just someone who's not really great with their off seasons, especially, that's always a good indicator of how they're going to do with when food comes back after the diet. I want them to think of it as the exact same goals as their low days, just with different numbers. You know, yeah, low days, it's 40 fat, 150 carbs. High day, we're just adding 200 grams of carbs to that. But it's exactly, everything else needs to be done the same. You put it on the scale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And once you've demonstrated to yourself primarily, but also to me, that you can handle an off season and a recovery diet, and you can maintain weight when needed or gain or lose, and you have a healthy relationship with your body and food, sure, that's when you can go out to eat and eyeball it, because we're primarily just trying to get you out of a deficit. And I'm okay if your fats go above 40 and your carbs are at 340 or 360 instead of 350. But I think that's a really important thing to emphasize, because this practice came out of the culture cheat meals and cheat days, you don't want to maintain that perspective. It's not just it's not time off the diet. It is a dietary tool. It's part of the preparation process. And I will say, last thing before, if you guys have anything you want to add to that, is that the side benefit of it being helpful for the peak week for competitors, a side benefit for non-competitors is that this is essentially just like a diet break, your time to practice maintenance. Because while a competitor, their goal is to get really, really lean and then gain that fat back pretty quickly, because that's not a good place to be for the goal of being a bodybuilder, as being shredded and having no testosterone production. For someone who is dieting for other reasons, the only reason you should be dieting typically, if you're not like a weight class restricted strength athlete, is to maintain the level of leanness you attain. You're trying to lose body fat to change your lifestyle, which means that what that lifestyle change looks like is not going to be a deficit. So those refeed days, those diet breaks become your ability to practice what it's going to be like after the fat loss phase is over. And I think that is a really useful mindset. It's not a cheat meal. It's not a cheat day. It's not a cheat week. It's, hey, eventually this diet's going to be over, and you need to operate in a place where you can maintain and sustain this lifestyle. So let's try that 2-3 days a week to see what it would be like to eat at maintenance in this new body with these new habits. Not just revert back to the habits that got me there in the first place, And I think that those are just some really important things, because I know some people do struggle with refeeds becoming the trigger for a binge and even sometimes the end of a diet.
Mm-hmm. And on the number side of the negative aspects of refeeds is jumping to conclusions too quickly. Because we've all seen where a lot of times, after a 2 or 3 day refeed, that fourth day, the body weight actually goes down, right? And a young coach, somebody that's just incorporating these things, for the first time, they might see that and think to themselves, oh, okay, well, and I've seen it a lot of times on social media posts. Oh, you know what? Third day of diet break and weight's going down. Got to eat more food. Got to eat more food. Got to eat more food. These are my new maintenance calories. And so they kind of jump to conclusions too quickly. Whereas if they had experience with watching what typically happens in other folks and also with themselves, that weight's going to eventually start going back up. Because eventually your body's going to recognize, okay, now this is actually a surplus. And there's a reason why you drop weight there. There's a few different reasons. Your body will drop water sometimes if you're really inflamed, and so the calories will kind of help you release that. And you see that immediate weight loss through a drop in that water. Sometimes your NEAT picks back up again, and so you'll kind of be like in this temporary state of maintenance or deficit just through increased NEAT. But eventually that's going to all start catching up, and you're going to start gaining weight on those refeed calories or those diet break calories that you kind of took in the short term. So point being,
like Berto says, like sometimes when you do by the time you've done a refeed, especially later stages in prep, you look like you got jumped in an alley. You're just like really beat up, and you haven't taken a shit in like a week. So yeah, if you empty out a bowel's, your entire bowel's worth of dookie, I can say it. Yeah. I got a PhD, and you drop all of this inflammation and diet related stress. Yeah, I mean sometimes you will see a full kilo drop over a 2 or 3 day period while you're in a surplus. Just remember that weight changes are not directly proportionate to energy balance. Yeah. So well said, Brad.
Yeah, and like I said, the point being is hold off on keep making those changes and keep making those calories go up and up and up and up. Kind of just watch how things happen and watch how things shake out. Throughout the duration of the diet break or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just like when when people first start a diet, they see this big whoosh of weight loss. Mm-hmm. They're in a new altered state. Their body's trying to figure out their new digestive pattern. It's figuring out its new maintenance, like how much does your body, how spendthrift or thrifty are you? Are you going to be burning a whole lot less or just burning a little bit less? How much more cardio are you doing? How does your diet change? How stressed are you in comparison to this? So you're going to find a new homeostasis once you start a diet. That's why we normally don't suggest making changes until a few weeks on the diet. Like you might get a 5-pound drop and go, oh, I need to eat more. Like, maybe not. Maybe just like you lost a whole lot of that initial weight. The same thing is true and opposite. Like if you've taken a diet break for the first time, a week on maintenance calories when you've been in a deficit for months, you don't really know what's happening. You don't know, your weight hasn't stabilized yet. Your look hasn't stabilized. Your body hasn't stabilized, and you have to give it some time to really know what's happening there. And so that's just a really good point that goes both ways. Gentlemen.
Dad?
I know we're fatigued from this discussion.
No,
Anything we want to add?
I think we're good when Eric says dookie. I think that's a good way to end it. Because he sounded smart for like 80 to 90 minutes, and he said dookie and killed it. But hey, it's all good.
Well, folks, now that we've pinched off that loaf, I think we can finish this one with a flush, and just wipe it and finish up.
There we go.
All right. Well, that was an awesome discussion, gentlemen. I cannot believe that we're damn near around our 150th podcast episode, and we're just now talking about refeeds.
I know. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, hey.
Better never.
Well said. Just like the dookies when you refeed.
Hey guys, this is Coach Alberto Nunez. Thanks so much for listening to our show today. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I wanted to take a moment to remind you guys that we have a giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The vault is a place where we have organized our best information, paired it up with some of our favorite resources, and shared with all of you guys in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole lot more. Most of it is free. Some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple of months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.